In the span of a single human lifetime, roughly 50 years, every great civilization on Earth ceased to exist. Not one, not a few, all of them, simultaneously. The palaces went dark, the trade routes went silent, the scribes put down their reed styluses and never picked them up again. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned overnight, their streets left empty, their granaries still half full, as if the people simply walked out into the dark and vanished. To understand the magnitude of what happened around 1200 BC, you have to first understand what the world looked like before it. This was not a dark age, this was not a period of primitive struggle. The Late Bronze Age was the most interconnected, cosmopolitan and prosperous era humanity had ever produced. The great powers of the ancient world, Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, Ugarit, the Kassite Babylonians, Assyria and Cyprus, all traded with each other, communicated through sophisticated diplomatic channels, and depended on a vast web of maritime commerce that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of modern-day Afghanistan. Bronze itself required tin and copper from distant lands, meaning no single empire could survive in isolation. They needed each other. And yet, in the blink of an eye, that world was gone. The hook for this story does not begin with Egypt or Greece. It begins with a single clay tablet discovered in the ruins of Ugarit, a once magnificent port city on the coast of modern-day Syria. Archaeologists unearthed it in what had been a kiln. The tablet was in the process of being fired when something interrupted the work permanently. On it, a desperate king writes to a neighbouring ruler begging for grain. His people are starving, his army has abandoned him, ships are burning on the coast. The letter is written with a trembling urgency that pierces across 3,000 years of silence. He never received a reply, because by the time that tablet was written, the kingdom it was addressed to no longer existed. The courier, if there ever was one, had nowhere left to deliver it. That tablet is not a curiosity, it is a window. It is a message in a bottle cast into a sea of centuries, and it tells us something extraordinary. Even as their world collapsed, the people living through it did not understand what was happening. The king of Ugarit did not know that his neighbouring ruler was already dead. He did not know that every empire around him was simultaneously unravelling. He thought this was a local crisis, a bad season, a military setback, a temporary shortage. He thought help was coming. It was not. What could possibly destroy every empire on Earth at exactly the same time? That is the question that has haunted historians, archaeologists and classicists for over a century. It is the central mystery of the ancient world. More dramatic, more complete, and in many ways more puzzling than the fall of Rome. Because Rome fell over centuries. The Bronze Age collapsed in decades, and unlike Rome, it left no successor civilization to carry the torch. Greece fell into a 400-year dark age. Writing disappeared, long-distance trade ceased, population plummeted. The infrastructure of civilization itself, the palace systems, the redistributive economies, the scribal traditions, all of it simply stopped. The theories are as varied as they are contested. Historians have proposed waves of mysterious invaders, known as the Sea Peoples, sweeping in from the west and destroying everything in their path. Climate scientists have pointed to catastrophic drought evidence in pollen cores and tree rings, suggesting a multi-decade famine that starved even the mightiest empires into submission. Seismologists have catalogued a terrifying sequence of earthquakes that struck the region in rapid succession, reducing some of the greatest palaces in history to rubble. Epidemiologists have speculated about disease. Systems theorists have argued that the collapse of one node in the trade network caused a cascade failure across all others, that the Bronze Age world was so tightly integrated it was also catastrophically fragile, like a modern financial system brought down by a single failing bank. The truth, as we will see across this series, is almost certainly a combination of all of these forces working in terrible synchrony. The Late Bronze Age did not fall to a single blow. It was struck by 100 blows at once, natural, human, economic and environmental, and it had no resilience left to absorb them. The same integration that had made it powerful had also made it dependent. Dependent on tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, grain from Egypt, timber from Lebanon. When the supply lines broke, when the harvest failed, when the sea raiders multiplied and the earthquake struck, there was no backup system. There was no redundancy, there was only collapse. But before we get to explanations, we must first feel the weight of what was lost. We must stand in the ruins of Ugarit and read that final desperate letter. We must walk through the ashes of Mycenae and understand that the people who built those lion-gated citadels were not primitive. They were sophisticated, literate, artistic, and deeply human. They had dreams and debts and families. They had a world. And then, in a matter of decades that must have felt to them like the end of all things, they didn't. That is the hook of this chapter. Not the spectacle of collapse, but the silence that followed it. Not the fire and the ruin, but that unanswered letter sitting in a kiln for 3,000 years, waiting for a reply that would never come. It is the most human artifact of one of history's greatest catastrophes, a moment of desperate hope frozen in clay, preserved by the very disaster that caused it. The city burned, the kiln hardened the tablet, and so the last words of a dying civilization survived, almost by accident, to be read by us. So what destroyed every empire on Earth at exactly the same time? The answer requires us to think about climate, migration, systems theory, geopolitics, and the fundamental fragility of complex societies. It requires us to understand not just ancient history, but the mechanics of civilizational collapse itself, a subject that, in the 21st century, feels less like ancient history and more like a warning. The Bronze Age died not because its people were weak or foolish, but because the world they had built was too interdependent to survive a cascade of simultaneous shocks. Sound familiar? It should. The lessons of 1200 BC are not buried in the past. They are watching us from the rubble. To understand what was lost, you have to first understand what existed. The year is 1250 BC, and the world is not what you might imagine. It is not a world of scattered tribes struggling against wilderness. It is not a world of crude huts and superstition. It is, by every meaningful measure, a civilization at the height of its powers, confident, connected, and astonishingly sophisticated. Stand at the center of it and look outward in every direction, and what you see is not the ancient past. What you see is something that feels unsettlingly familiar, a globalized world, bound together by trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence, humming with commerce and ambition. Begin in Egypt, because Egypt is where the story of power begins. Under Pharaoh Ramesses II, who ruled for an extraordinary 66 years, longer than most of his subjects would live, Egypt was the undisputed superpower of the ancient world. His empire stretched from the Sudan in the south to the borders of modern Syria in the north, encompassing the most productive agricultural land on earth, watered by the annual flooding of the Nile. The monuments Ramesses built were not merely expressions of vanity. They were declarations of permanence, statements carved in stone that said, "We are eternal." The temples at Karnak and Luxor, the Ramesseum, the colossal statues of Abu Simbel cut directly into the sandstone cliffs of Nubia, all of it constructed on an industrial scale, using a state bureaucracy so refined it could coordinate thousands of workers across hundreds of miles. Egypt had professional soldiers, a standing navy, granaries capable of feeding entire nations, and a diplomatic correspondence system that linked it to every major power in the known world. Ramesses himself exchanged letters with Hittite kings as equals, signed peace treaties, and corresponded with rulers from Babylon to Cyprus. He was not a god-king in the sense of fantasy. He was something more precise, the chief executive officer of history's first superstate. To Egypt's north, stretching across the vast Anatolian plateau that is now Turkey, lay the Hittite Empire, and the Hittites are perhaps the most underappreciated great power of the ancient world. They spoke an Indo-European language, making them linguistic cousins of the Greeks, Romans, and ultimately of most of modern Europe. They were the first major civilization to master iron smelting, though they kept the technique closely guarded as a state secret, trading iron objects only as diplomatic gifts to the most favored allies. Their capital, Hattusa, was a city of temples, palaces, and archives containing thousands of clay tablets recording everything from royal decrees to mythological texts to a complete medical treatise. The Hittites fought Ramesses II to a bloody stalemate at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, one of the largest chariot battles in history, and then remarkably sat down and negotiated the world's first surviving peace treaty. That document, the Treaty of Kadesh, still exists in two versions, the Egyptian hieroglyphic account and the Hittite cuneiform account. A replica hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York. The Hittites were not barbarians at the gate. They were a literate, legally sophisticated empire that understood the value of diplomacy alongside the value of a sword. To the northwest of the Hittites, across the Aegean Sea, lay the Mycenaean Greeks. And here is where the story becomes personal for those of us who grew up with Homer. The world of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the world of Achilles and Agamemnon and the Siege of Troy, was not mythology in the sense of invention, it was mythology in the sense of memory. The palace at Mycenae, with its famous Lion Gate, was real. The citadels at Tiryns, Athens and Pylos were real. Massive, sophisticated structures built with stones so enormous that later Greeks, unable to explain how they were moved, assumed they had been built by the Cyclops. The Mycenaeans were palace-based administrators who kept detailed records in a writing system called Linear B, the earliest known form of the Greek language, accounting for everything from grain allocations to chariot wheels to perfume inventories. They were traders, warriors, and builders of ships that ranged as far west as Italy and as far east as Cyprus and the Levant. Their civilization was not a quiet pastoral idyll. It was an intensely organized, militarized, commercially active society, plugged deeply into the Bronze Age world economy. Between Greece and Egypt on the Levantine coast lay one of the most extraordinary cities in the ancient world, Ugarit. If Mycenae was the warrior and Hattusa was the soldier administrator, Ugarit was the banker. It was a merchant republic in the truest sense, a city whose entire identity was built around trade. Its harbour received ships from across the Mediterranean, and its warehouses held goods from every corner of the Bronze Age world: Cypriot copper, Aegean pottery, Egyptian gold and linen, Mesopotamian tin, Anatolian silver, cedar wood from Lebanon, olive oil from Canaan. The scribes of Ugarit worked in multiple languages simultaneously: Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hurrian, Egyptian, Hittite, because international commerce required linguistic flexibility. Ugarit had its own alphabet, one of the earliest in history, developed precisely because merchants needed a faster, simpler writing system than the complex cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphics of Egypt. It was a city built on the practical needs of money, and it was fabulously, almost absurdly wealthy. And yet, despite all of that wealth and sophistication, it would be among the first to fall. Further east lay the ancient heartlands of Mesopotamia, Babylon under the Kassite dynasty, and the rising power of Assyria to the north. Babylon in 1250 BC was already ancient. Its great law code, the Code of Hammurabi, had been inscribed nearly 600 years earlier. Its temples and ziggurats had been rebuilt and expanded across generations. It was a city of scholars, astronomers, and physicians, producing mathematical tablets of startling precision and medical texts that describe symptoms and treatments in systematic, empirical language. Assyria, meanwhile, was a militarized trading state that had built its early wealth on the overland tin trade with Anatolia and was steadily growing in power, its armies becoming the most feared in the region. Cyprus, the great copper island at the center of the eastern Mediterranean, was producing more copper than any other source in the ancient world, supplying the raw material without which Bronze Age civilization literally could not function. And Canaan, the strip of coastal land running through modern Israel and Lebanon, was a patchwork of city-states, each one a node in the trade network, supplying grain, oil, wine, dye, and cedar wood to the great powers surrounding it. What bound all of these civilizations together was not merely proximity or shared religion, it was commerce and the radical interdependency that commerce creates. Bronze, the defining material of the age, requires two metals, copper and tin. But copper and tin are almost never found in the same place. The great copper sources were Cyprus and the Aegean. The great tin sources were Afghanistan, Central Asia, and possibly southwestern Europe. That means that, To make a single bronze sword, materials had to travel thousands of miles and pass through dozens of hands. To make enough bronze to equip an army, you needed functioning trade routes spanning half the known world, reliable merchant fleets, trustworthy middlemen, agreed-upon weights and measures, systems of credit and diplomatic relationships stable enough to keep the sea lanes open. In other words, to be a Bronze Age great power, you could not be self-sufficient. You had to be entangled. The late Bronze Age powers understood this entanglement and managed it with surprising sophistication. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence discovered in Egypt in 1887, reveal a world of royal pen pals writing to each other with the familiarity of modern heads of state. Kings addressed each other as brothers. They sent each other gifts, gold, horses, lapis lazuli, perfume, princesses for marriage alliances. They negotiated trade disputes, complained about delayed shipments, and expressed condolences at each other's losses. This was not a world of isolated kingdoms glaring at each other across hostile borders. This was a world of deeply, almost dangerously interconnected powers, each depending on the others for the raw materials, finished goods, and political stability that kept their economies running. It was, in the truest sense, a Bronze Age version of globalization. And like all systems of extreme interdependency, it had one profound hidden weakness. If enough of the threads broke at once, the whole fabric could unravel. This, then, was the world of 1250 BC. Not primitive, not fragile in the obvious sense. Rich, confident, administratively complex, militarily powerful, and deeply woven together by 50 years of peace and profitable trade following the Treaty of Kadesh. The Hittite king and the Egyptian pharaoh were, in a meaningful sense, partners. The merchants of Ugarit knew the price of copper in Cyprus as well as they knew the price of grain in their own market. Every catastrophe in history has a prologue. Every collapse has its tremors. Small, dismissible, easy to explain away in isolation, arriving long before the earthquake that no one survives. The Bronze Age collapse was no different. The warning signs began accumulating around 1250 BC, roughly 50 years before the final shattering end. They were written in pollen and ash, in drought-stricken soil and delayed shipments, in panicked letters and political intrigue. They were visible in retrospect to anyone who cared to look across the whole picture. The tragedy is that no one in 1250 BC had the vantage point to see the whole picture. They saw only their corner of the world, and in their corner, things still seemed, if not entirely comfortable, then at least survivable. The first warning came not from any human source, but from the Earth itself. Scientists working in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have extracted pollen core samples from lake beds and sea sediments across the eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Delta, the Aegean coast, the highlands of Anatolia, the Jordan Valley, and what those cores reveal is sobering. Beginning around 1250 BC and intensifying sharply through the following decades, the pollen record shows a dramatic decline in arboreal vegetation and cultivated crops across the entire region. Olive trees, which require stable rainfall and are extremely sensitive to prolonged drought, effectively disappear from the pollen record in several sites. Grain pollen collapses. What replaces them is the pollen of drought-tolerant scrub plants, the botanical equivalent of a distress signal. Something was going wrong with the climate of the eastern Mediterranean, and it was going wrong everywhere at once. The rains were failing, not in one location, not in one season. Across the entire region, year after year, the harvest was getting thinner. For a civilization built on grain surpluses, and every Bronze Age civilization was built on grain surpluses, this was a slow-motion emergency. The palace economies of Mycenae, Hattusa, and Ugarit all functioned on the same basic principle. The palace collected taxes and grain, stored them in enormous state granaries, and redistributed them to soldiers, craftsmen, and bureaucrats who produced the goods and services that kept the state running. Take away the grain surplus, and the whole system begins to seize up like an engine running without oil. Armies can't be fed, craftsmen can't be paid, trade expeditions can't be provisioned. The palace, which was the engine of Bronze Age civilization, begins to stall. And in the letters and records of the period, you can see it happening. Egyptian texts from the reign of Meremptah, Ramesses II's successor, explicitly mentioned sending grain shipments to the Hittites to prevent famine. The Hittites, masters of Anatolia, builders of Hattusa, the empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill, were asking their old rival for food. But drought was not the only assault on the Bronze Age world. The earth itself was unstable. Archaeologists and seismologists studying the destruction layers of late Bronze Age sites have identified a remarkable and deeply disturbing pattern. Between roughly 1225 and 1175 BC, a sequence of major earthquakes struck cities across the eastern Mediterranean in rapid succession. Mycenae shows evidence of earthquake damage. Tiryns was severely damaged and partially rebuilt. The Great Palace at Ugarit shows signs of structural collapse consistent with seismic activity. Sites in Cyprus, in the Levant, and across Anatolia all show the same dark destruction layer. A band of ash, charcoal, and tumbled stone that archaeologists have learned to read like a sentence. Something destroyed this, suddenly and violently. The archaeologist Amos Noor, one of the first scholars to systematically study the role of earthquakes in the Bronze Age collapse, estimated that the eastern Mediterranean experienced what may have been a prolonged seismic storm, a sequence of large earthquakes along fault lines that may have been triggered in sequence, each one stressing the next fault further until the whole region was shaking. Individually, a city could survive an earthquake. Bronze Age builders knew how to repair stone walls and rebuild fallen columns, but an earthquake strikes at the worst possible moment when your granaries are already half empty from years of drought and your tax revenues are declining because the farmers have less to give. Reconstruction costs grain, it costs labour, it costs timber and stone that might otherwise have gone into ships and trade goods. Every earthquake that struck a Bronze Age palace was not just a physical blow, it was an economic one, arriving at exactly the moment when there was the least surplus to absorb it. And then there were the Sea Peoples. Their first appearance in the historical record is almost casual, a brief mention in Egyptian documents from the reign of Meremptah around 1208 BC, describing raiders attacking from the sea in alliance with the Libyan tribes threatening Egypt's western delta. They are described in the Egyptian records with a mixture of contempt and anxiety, listed by a series of names that scholars have debated ever since: the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and others. Who were these people? Where did they come from? The answer, maddeningly, is that we still don't fully know. The leading theories place their origins in the Aegean, possibly among displaced Mycenaean populations, or in Anatolia, or in a mix of disrupted populations set in motion by the very droughts and upheavals already destabilizing the region. What we do know is that they were not simply raiders. The Egyptian records make clear that the Sea Peoples travelled with their families, with women, children and cattle loaded onto ox carts alongside their warriors. This was not a raiding party. This was a migration, an entire displaced people moving through the eastern Mediterranean with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose, carving a path of destruction through every civilization in their path. The Sea Peoples are perhaps the most dramatic element of the Bronze Age collapse, and also the most misunderstood. For generations, historians treated them as the primary cause of the collapse, a mysterious invasion force that swept away the Bronze Age world like a tide. Modern scholarship has complicated that picture considerably. The Sea Peoples were almost certainly as much a symptom of the collapse as a cause of it. The drought, the earthquakes, the disruption of trade networks. These forces set populations in motion long before the Sea Peoples appeared in Egyptian records. The Mycenaean world may already have been fracturing from within, its palace economy under strain from food shortages and political instability before any external invader arrived. But even if the Sea Peoples were partly a symptom, they were also absolutely a cause. Their movement through the eastern Mediterranean shattered the trade networks that the surviving civilizations still depended on for raw materials. Their attacks on coastal cities disrupted the sea lanes through which bronze flowed. They were, in the most terrible sense, the spark that fell into the powder keg, and the powder keg had been filling for 50 years. Alongside drought, earthquakes, and the first migrations of the Sea Peoples, the trade records of the period begin to show something equally alarming. The Bronze Age global economy was stuttering. Ships were arriving late or not at all. Grain shipments documented in one letter as dispatched had no corresponding receipt in the archives of the destination city. Merchants who had operated the same routes for decades began writing anxious letters about goods that never arrived, payments that weren't made, contracts that went unfulfilled. The tin supply, that critical ingredient without which bronze could not be made, became increasingly erratic. If the tin stopped moving, the weapons stopped being made, the tools stopped being forged, the palace workshops went quiet. In the interconnected Bronze Age economy, a disruption in one supply chain didn't just affect one city, it rippled outward through the entire network, because every node in that network depended on the others. A drought in the grain-producing Levant reduced Egypt's export capacity. Reduced Egyptian exports meant less grain reaching the Hittites. Less grain reaching the Hittites meant less political stability in Anatolia. Less political stability in Anatolia threatened the overland tin routes from the east. Threatened tin routes reduced copper processing in Cyprus. Reduced copper in Cyprus meant fewer bronze tools reaching Mycenaean workshops. And so on, around the network, each disruption amplifying the next. Inside the Hittite Empire, the political fabric was also beginning to tear. The decades following the Great Peace with Egypt saw a succession of weak or contested rulers, internal power struggles, and increasing difficulty controlling the empire's vast periphery. Vassal states that had been reliable for generations began pushing back against Hittite authority. The western territories of Anatolia, Azawa, Lucca, Asua, grew increasingly restive. There were revolts, defections, and military campaigns that drained resources the empire could no longer easily spare. The Hittite king found himself fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, against external threats, against internal rivals, and against the slow erosion of the economic system that funded his army and fed his bureaucracy. The Hittite records from this period have a quality of exhausted improvisation, emergency responses to emergencies that never quite stop arriving. They appear in the historical record the way a storm appears on the horizon, first as a rumour, then as a dark smear, then all at once as something enormous and unstoppable bearing down on everything in its path. The Sea Peoples. The name itself is not theirs, it is what the Egyptians called them, a collective label applied to a loose and probably diverse confederation of seafaring groups who descended on the eastern Mediterranean coast beginning around 1208 BC, overwhelming city after city, burning coastal settlements, scattering armies, and dissolving the trade networks that held the Bronze Age world together. For over a century after their discovery in the Egyptian records, historians treated the Sea Peoples as the answer to the question of Bronze Age collapse. Here were the destroyers. Here was the invasion force that swept the ancient world from the map. Case closed. Except that the more carefully scholars examined the evidence, the more unsatisfying that explanation became, and the more the Sea Peoples began to look less like the cause of the catastrophe and more like its most visible and heartbreaking symptom. The Egyptian records give us names for the various groups that comprise the Sea Peoples: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, but almost nothing else. No origin stories, no homeland geography, no explanation of where they came from before they arrived at the edges of the Egyptian world. This absence of origin is itself one of the great mysteries of ancient history. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They catalogued the enemies they fought with obsessive detail, identifying their homelands, their kings, their gods. But the Sea Peoples arrive in the records essentially from nowhere, labelled only by what they did rather than where they came from. This has given historians centuries of room to speculate, and the scholarship reflects that freedom. The Sea Peoples have been theorized as displaced Mycenaean Greeks, as refugees from Anatolia following the Hittite collapse, as populations from the western Mediterranean, Sardinia, Sicily, the Italian coast, set in motion by disruptions we cannot yet fully trace, and as a mixture of all of the above, a rolling coalition of the dispossessed gathering momentum and desperate people as it moved east and south through the dying Bronze Age world. The most credible modern synthesis is also the most tragic. The Sea Peoples were, in all likelihood, not a single people at all, but a cascading series of displaced populations, each displacement triggering the next in a chain reaction that fed on itself. Imagine the process. Drought and famine strike the Aegean coast. destabilizing Mycenaean farming communities already under pressure from palace system failures. Those communities break apart. Some of their people take to the sea, not as conquerors but as survivors, moving toward wherever food might still exist. They arrive on the coast of Anatolia or Cyprus, already strained by its own droughts and earthquakes, and their arrival, hungry, armed, desperate, tips the balance there. Now Anatolian populations are set in motion. They join the movement. The coalition grows. It moves toward the Levant, toward the last still functioning breadbaskets of the ancient world, Egypt and Canaan. And as it moves, it burns what it cannot consume, destroys what resists, and leaves nothing behind that could sustain the civilization it has just passed through. Not out of pure malice, but out of the terrible mathematics of survival. A starving people does not leave food for its enemies. This reframing from invaders to refugees does not make the Sea Peoples any less destructive. The cities they burned were just as ash whether the fire was set by conquerors or by climate refugees. The people who died in those attacks were just as dead. But it changes the moral architecture of the story entirely. If the Sea Peoples were refugees produced by the same forces of drought, famine, and systemic collapse that were simultaneously destroying Egypt and the Hittites, then there is no villain to point at. There is only catastrophe producing catastrophe, displacement generating displacement, each wave of the dying world crashing into the next and dragging it under. The Bronze Age collapse becomes not a story about a great civilization defeated by a barbaric outside force. It becomes a story about a highly complex, highly integrated system that, when it began to fail, produced the very forces that accelerated its own destruction. And yet, the Egyptians fought back, and for a moment it seemed like they might win. The reign of Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, was defined almost entirely by his wars against the Sea Peoples. In his 8th regnal year, around 1175 BC, a massive confederation of Sea Peoples launched what appears to have been a coordinated assault on Egypt itself, by land and by sea simultaneously. The land attack drove down through Canaan, overwhelming the Canaanite city-states that had served as Egypt's buffer zone for generations. The sea attack aimed at the Nile Delta, the agricultural heartland of Egyptian civilization. Ramesses met the sea attack with a fleet of his own in what is recorded as the Battle of the Delta, one of the earliest naval battles in recorded history. The Egyptian records, carved in enormous relief panels on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, describe a total and devastating Egyptian victory. The Sea People's ships were trapped against the shore, their warriors slaughtered or taken prisoner, the leaders of the coalition captured and brought before the pharaoh in humiliation. Ramesses declared it one of the greatest victories in Egyptian history. He was not entirely lying. The battle was real. Egypt was not overrun. The Sea Peoples did not conquer the Nile Valley. In that narrow military sense, Ramesses III won. But here is the key contradiction at the heart of this chapter, and one of the most revealing paradoxes in all of ancient history. Ramesses III claimed a great victory over the Sea Peoples, and Egypt never recovered. The decades following his reign saw a slow, grinding deterioration of Egyptian power that never reversed. The treasury emptied, the military weakened, the administrative system that had held the empire together for centuries began to fragment. Within a generation of his great victory, Egypt had lost its Syrian territories permanently. Within 2 generations, it had lost Canaan. The foreign mercenaries who had fought under Egyptian command began to settle in the very territories they had been hired to protect, establishing their own communities. The Peliset, for example, settling on the southern coast of Canaan and becoming, in the historical memory of their neighbours, the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III were shadows of their predecessors, weak, short-reigned, dominated by a priestly class that increasingly held the real power. Egypt had won the battle. It was losing everything else. What does this tell us? It tells us that the Sea Peoples did not destroy Egypt the way a conquering army destroys a city, by burning it to the ground in a single assault. They destroyed it the way a hemorrhage destroys a body, by draining it, slowly but consistently, of the resources it needed to survive. Every military campaign against the Sea Peoples cost grain, metal, ships, and men. Every coastal city lost to Sea Peoples raiders was a port that no longer generated tax revenue, a market that no longer received trade goods, a granary that no longer contributed to the state surplus. The cumulative cost of decades of warfare against an enemy that could not be permanently defeated, because the forces producing that enemy, the drought and famine and displacement, were still operating, was simply more than an already weakened Bronze Age economy could bear. Ramesses III could carve his victories in stone. He could not carve away the drought. He could not carve away the broken trade routes. He could not carve away the structural fragility of a palace economy that had been operating under compounding stress for 50 years. The Sea Peoples, in the end, are a mirror. They reflect back at us the nature of civilizational collapse in its most human form. They were not monsters from outside history. They were history, the human wreckage of a systemic catastrophe set in motion by forces no individual group chose or controlled, moving through the ancient world with the unstoppable momentum of desperation. Some of them became the ancestors of peoples we know well, the Philistines of the Bible, possibly the Etruscans of Italy, possibly some of the peoples of Cyprus and the Levantine coast. They settled, they built, they forgot over generations where they had come from and what had driven them across the sea. Their children grew up in the ruins of the world their parents had, however unwillingly, helped destroy, and built something new in its place. But the question of what they were, destroyers or refugees, is ultimately a false choice, and that is precisely the point. They were both. They were what people become when their world disappears. Dangerous, desperate, capable of terrible violence, and at the same time, simply human beings trying to find a place to eat and sleep and survive. The Bronze Age collapse produced the Sea Peoples. For most of the 20th century, the Bronze Age collapse was understood almost entirely through the written record, the letters, the inscriptions, the palace accounts, the battle reliefs. Historians read the documents and built their theories from words. But documents have a fundamental limitation. They record only what people chose to write down, and people tend not to write down things they do not understand. A drought that lasted 50 years would not appear in an Egyptian inscription as a drought. It would appear as a military failure, a treasury shortfall, a political crisis, a divine punishment. The climate was invisible inside the human record because the humans living through it lacked the scientific tools to identify it. What changed the story was not new documents. It was science reaching back into the earth itself and reading what the earth had recorded independently of human intention, in pollen grains, tree rings, lake sediments, and isotope ratios that no Bronze Age scribe could have known were there. The pivotal study arrived in 2013, published by researchers from the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, working in collaboration with colleagues from multiple institutions. Their data source was the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Kinneret as it is known in Hebrew, one of the most scientifically valuable lakes in the region because it has been continuously fed by the same watershed for thousands of years, accumulating sediment layers that function as a precise, undisturbed archive of regional climate. The researchers extracted sediment cores from the lake bed and analysed the pollen content layer by layer, identifying the types of vegetation growing in the surrounding region across thousands of years. What they found in the layers corresponding to approximately 1200 BC was striking and unambiguous. A dramatic, sudden decline in arboreal pollen, the signature of trees, replaced by the pollen of drought-tolerant grasses and shrubs. Olive cultivation collapsed, oak woodland retreated. The agricultural mosaic that had supported Bronze Age civilization in the Levant essentially vanished in the sediment record and did not begin to recover for centuries. The drought was not a hypothesis anymore, it was a physical measurement. The pollen data from the Sea of Galilee did not stand alone for long. Researchers working across the broader region began to find corroborating evidence in multiple independent data sources, each one pointing toward the same conclusion from a different angle. Tree ring records, the science of dendrochronology, which reads climate history and the annual growth patterns preserved inside ancient wood, provided another line of evidence. Trees produce wide, dense rings in good years with abundant rainfall and narrow, thin rings in dry years with poor growing conditions. Ancient timber preserved in archaeological sites across Anatolia, Greece and the Levant began to reveal a consistent pattern of narrow rings concentrated in the late 13th and 12th centuries BC, the exact period of the Bronze Age collapse. Some sequences showed multiple consecutive years of severely reduced growth, indicating not a single bad drought year, but a sustained, multi-decade pattern of deficient rainfall. The trees were writing the same story as the pollen in a completely different biological language. Isotope analysis added a third confirmation. Oxygen isotope ratios preserved in ancient stalagmites, the cave formations that grow from minerals dissolved in groundwater, record rainfall intensity with remarkable precision because the ratio of heavy to light oxygen atoms in water changes depending on how much evaporation has occurred before it reaches the ground. Stalagmites from caves in Israel, Turkey, and the broader Eastern Mediterranean tell a consistent story of declining rainfall intensity beginning around 1250 BC and reaching severe levels by 1200 BC. The convergence of three independent scientific methodologies, pollen analysis, dendrochronology, and isotope geochemistry, all pointing to the same event at the same time, is, in scientific terms, as close to certainty as ancient climate reconstruction gets. The Eastern Mediterranean experienced a prolonged severe drought beginning around 1200 BC. That much is now established fact, not theory. But raw climate data is abstract. To understand what a 50-year drought actually does to a Bronze Age civilization, you have to translate it into human terms, into grain, into armies, into the political mathematics of power. Every Bronze Age palace economy ran on an agricultural surplus. The palace taxed the farmers paid in grain. The grain fed the soldiers, the craftsmen, the scribes, and the palace dependents who produced everything from bronze weapons to luxury textiles. Remove the grain surplus and you remove the foundation of the entire system simultaneously. The army goes unfed, or more precisely, the army goes underpaid, because in a Bronze Age economy, grain was money. Unpaid soldiers do not remain loyal soldiers. They desert, defect, or turn on the population they were supposed to protect. The craftsmen in the palace workshops have no raw materials and no food allocation, so they leave, dispersing the specialized technical knowledge that took generations to accumulate. The scribes who maintained the palace records have nothing left to record, and then they too are gone, taking with them the administrative literacy that held the redistributive economy together. A drought does not merely starve people. In a palace economy, it dissolves institutions. The domino sequence is almost mechanical once it begins. Drought reduces harvests. Reduced harvests shrink the taxable surplus. A shrinking surplus forces the palace to cut military pay and reduce craftsmen's rations. Underpaid soldiers stop appearing for muster or sell their services to whoever will feed them. Craft production collapses for lack of materials and workers. International trade, which depended on craft goods as export currency, declines. Declining trade reduces the palace's access to imported raw materials, including the tin that makes bronze. Without bronze, the military weakens further. A weakened military invites raids from those who have been displaced by the same drought in neighboring regions. Raids destroy villages and disrupt agriculture further. More people flee, more farmland is abandoned. The harvest shrinks again. Each step of the cycle feeds the next. Each turn of the wheel makes the system weaker and the crisis harder to reverse. This is what collapse looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic single blow, but a compounding spiral of interconnected failures that accelerates past any point at which the system could have saved itself. And yet, here is where the climate explanation, for all its scientific power and precision, runs into a boundary it cannot cross alone, because when researchers mapped the drought evidence against the archaeological collapse evidence, they found a persistent and troubling anomaly. Some regions that showed little or no drought signature in the climate record also collapsed. Parts of Cyprus, certain Aegean island communities, and some interior Anatolian areas show Bronze Age collapse destruction layers or abandonment events that do not correlate neatly with the drought data. Conversely, some regions that were severely drought affected, including parts of the Levantine coast and the Upper Nile Valley, showed greater resilience and earlier recovery than the climate data alone would predict. The drought was real, it was severe, it was a major driver of collapse. But it was not the complete explanation. Something else was also at work. Something that drought could initiate but not fully account for. Something that spread through the network of Bronze Age civilization by a different mechanism than dry air and empty clouds. The answer that modern systems scholars have increasingly converged on is not a second separate cause, but a property of the system itself, fragility born from complexity. The Bronze Age world had spent 2 centuries building an extraordinarily efficient, tightly integrated international economy. Every efficiency gain came with a corresponding reduction in redundancy. A city that specialized in bronze production and traded for grain was more productive than a city that did both, but it was also more vulnerable. A trade network that ran on just-in-time delivery of tin from Afghanistan was faster and cheaper than one with large local reserves, but it had no buffer when the supply chain broke. The more interconnected the system became, and the more each node depended on every other node, the more any significant shock anywhere in the network became a shock everywhere in the network simultaneously. Drought was the shock. But the reason that shock became a civilizational collapse rather than a bad century was the system's radical lack of resilience, its inability to absorb disruption at any single point without transmitting that disruption to every other point. The Bronze Age world was, in the language of modern risk analysis, too big to fail, which is another way of saying too complex to survive. Climate, in the end, is not a villain. It is a condition, indifferent, patient, and operating on timescales that dwarf human civilization. The drought that helped destroy the Bronze Age world was not targeted at any particular empire or culture. It fell on the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Mycenaeans and the merchants of Ugarit with absolute impartiality. What determined who suffered more, who collapsed faster, who perhaps managed a few more decades of function, was not the rainfall itself, but the internal organization of each society, how much grain reserve it held, how diversified its economy was, how robust its political institutions were, how capable its rulers were of making hard decisions under pressure. The climate pulled the thread. The weaving determined how fast the fabric came apart. And that observation, that the same external shock produces different outcomes in different systems depending on those systems' internal resilience, is perhaps the most important lesson the Bronze Age collapse has to offer a 21st century world that is, once again, watching its climate change in ways its institutions were not designed to handle. Archaeology does not lie. It cannot be edited, rewritten, or revised to serve a king's propaganda. When a city burns, truly burns, catastrophically, with no one left to clean up or rebuild, what happens to the physical evidence of that burning is preserved with a fidelity that no document can match. The ash layer does not fade, the melted bronze does not disappear. The pottery shattered in the destruction does not reassemble itself into something less devastating. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from Syria to Greece to Anatolia to Canaan, archaeologists excavating Bronze Age sites have encountered the same sequence, repeated so consistently it has become one of the most recognizable signatures in the entire discipline. A thick destruction layer, dating to the late 13th or early 12th century BC, composed of ash, charcoal, collapsed mud brick, burned timber, shattered pottery, and abandoned valuables. Site after site, city after city, the same layer, the same date, the same silence above it. Begin where the chapter of the whole series begins, Ugarit. The excavation of Ugarit, which French archaeologists first began in 1929 at the coastal mound of Ras Shamra in northern Syria, produced one of the most haunting discoveries in the history of the discipline. When excavators reached the destruction layer, identifiable immediately by the change from organized occupation debris to a thick band of ash and collapsed structure, they found the city frozen at the moment of its end, not cleaned out, not gradually abandoned, not looted over generations. Frozen. In one building, now called the House of the High Priest, they found a clay tablet in the process of being fired in a kiln. The kiln that preserved the desperate final letter described in the opening chapter of this series. In other rooms, they found bronze weapons still in their storage racks. In the food preparation areas, they found grain in storage jars, olive oil in ceramic vessels, and in at least one oven, the carbonized remnants of bread that had been baking when the city died. Bread in the oven, grain in the jars, weapons on the racks. These are not the artifacts of a population that had time to plan or pack. These are the artifacts of people who were interrupted mid-sentence, mid-meal, mid-day, and never came back. Ugarit was destroyed around 1185 BC. It was never rebuilt. Not partially, not eventually, not in a reduced form. It ceased completely and permanently to exist as a functioning settlement. Mycenae tells a different kind of story, and in some ways a more philosophically unsettling one. The great citadel of Mycenae with its lion gate and its treasury of Atreus, its massive cyclopean walls built from stones so enormous that later Greeks assumed supernatural builders were responsible, was not simply burned, it was survived, partially, briefly, inadequately. The palace at Mycenae shows clear destruction evidence around 1200 BC, a fire of intense heat that melted pottery and warped bronze fittings, a collapse of roof structures across the main administrative complex. But the citadel was not immediately abandoned. There is archaeological evidence of continued reduced habitation within the walls for at least a generation after the palace destruction, smaller, simpler, using the ruins of the great administrative complex as a quarry for building materials. The Great Palace was not rebuilt. Its tablets were not rewritten. Its administrative system, the linear B accounting that had tracked every sheep and every wheel and every jar of perfume in the kingdom, vanished entirely. Linear B, the earliest known form of Greek writing, disappears from the archaeological record so completely after the Bronze Age collapse that when scholars first deciphered it in 1952, they were genuinely shocked to discover it was Greek. No one had known the Greeks could write that early. The knowledge had been lost so thoroughly, for so long, that it had ceased to exist in cultural memory. Writing itself had ended and been forgotten. The fate of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, is perhaps the most dramatic of all the destruction narratives because of the sheer implausibility of what happened. Hattusa was, by every measure, one of the most defensively formidable cities ever built in the ancient world. Its walls stretched for more than 6 kilometers, incorporating massive stone foundations, mud brick superstructures, and elaborate tower and gate systems, including the famous Lion Gate and Sphinx Gate. The city sat on a high rocky plateau in the interior of Anatolia, far from the coast, with commanding views of the surrounding terrain. Its granaries were among the largest in the known world. Its archives, the thousands of cuneiform tablets recording Hittite lore, mythology, diplomacy, and royal correspondence, represented one of the greatest concentrations of administrative knowledge in the Bronze Age. And yet, around 1200 BC, Hattusa was abandoned. The archaeological record shows something remarkable and deeply strange. Before the final destruction, the city was systematically emptied. Valuables were removed. The archives were, at least partially, taken out. The temples were stripped of their cult objects. It is as if the population knew the end was coming and had time to pack some of what mattered most before leaving. Then the empty city was burned. Who burned it is unknown. Perhaps the departing population itself denying the ruins to whoever was coming. Perhaps arriving attackers. Perhaps the Cascus, a persistent enemy from the north. The fire was real and thorough, and after it, Hattusa was never reoccupied as a major urban centre. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, the civilization that had fought Egypt to a standstill and negotiated the world's first peace treaty, ceased to exist. Move south from Hattusa, through Anatolia, and into the Levant, and the destruction layers continue with a grim regularity that archaeologists have come to call the 1200 BC horizon. Megiddo, the great Canaanite city whose name would eventually pass into the Hebrew Bible and into the Greek New Testament as Armageddon, shows a comprehensive destruction layer precisely within this period. The city was subsequently rebuilt, but in a noticeably reduced form, lacking the elaborate palace complex and administrative infrastructure of its late Bronze Age predecessor. Ashdod, on the southern Canaanite coast, shows destruction followed by reoccupation, but the new occupants are archaeologically distinct from the previous population. Their pottery of a different style, their building techniques different, their material culture suggesting they were among the sea peoples settling into the vacuum left by the collapse. Lachish, one of the most important Canaanite city-states, was destroyed so completely that it was abandoned for over a century before any significant reoccupation began. The pattern repeats across site after site across the Levant. Destruction, abandonment, or reoccupation by a different population, reduction of urban scale and administrative complexity, loss of literacy and long-distance trade connections. And then there is Troy. The site of Hisarlik on the western coast of Anatolia has been excavated and re-excavated since Heinrich Schliemann first dug into it in the 1870s. Convinced, correctly as it turned out, though his methods were sometimes destructive, that Homer's Iliad preserved a genuine historical memory. The city at Hisarlik has at least 9 major occupation layers, each built atop the ruins of the previous one. Troy 6, the grand, well-planned city with palatial buildings and large defensive walls, was destroyed around 1300 BC, probably by earthquake, based on the archaeological evidence. Troy 7a, which was built immediately atop its ruins and is now the leading candidate for the historical Troy of the Iliad, is a noticeably different kind of city. Where Troy 6 had spacious, planned architecture, Troy 7 is cramped and improvised, its streets narrowed, its houses smaller and more tightly packed, its storage jars sunk into the floors of homes in a way that archaeologists read as emergency food hoarding, the material signature of a population under siege, physically bracing for disaster. Troy 7. A was destroyed around 1180 BC in a fire, with evidence of violent conflict in the destruction layer. Whether that destruction was the Trojan War of Homer's Iliad, whether a coalition of Mycenaean Greek warriors under Agamemnon actually besieged and sacked this city, is a question that archaeology alone cannot definitively answer. What it can tell us is this: Troy 7a was destroyed, and its destroyers, whoever they were, came from a world that was itself collapsing. The Mycenaean palace states that might have launched a Trojan expedition were already under severe internal stress by 1200 BC. The Linear B tablets from Pylos, the best-preserved Mycenaean administrative archive, recovered from a palace that was itself destroyed around 1180 BC, reveal a kingdom on an emergency footing in its final days. The tablets record the hasty requisitioning of bronze from temple offerings to make weapons, sacred metal being melted down for spears and arrowheads. They record the posting of watchers along the coastline, suggesting an expected attack from the sea. They record the mobilization of rowers for the fleet, and then the tablets end. The palace was burned, the administrative system shut down mid-operation, mid-sentence, leaving the last entries on clay tablets that the fire accidentally preserved. Pylos, which had no defensive walls, the only major Mycenaean palace without them, was destroyed so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt, never reoccupied at any significant scale, its final bureaucratic records baked into permanence by the flames that killed the kingdom. What the archaeological record gives us across all of these sites is something more powerful than any single document. It gives us convergence. Not one city burning, which could be accident or local war. Not 5 cities burning, which could be a regional conflict. Dozens of cities across thousands of miles, all showing the same destruction layer, all dating to the same narrow window of roughly 50 years, all showing the same absence of recovery or reduced and changed occupation in the levels above. The destruction is not random, it is not coincidental. It follows the map of the Bronze Age international system, hitting hardest at the ports, the palace centres, the administrative nodes, the trade hubs. The places that were most deeply integrated into the Bronze Age world economy were, almost without exception, the places that burned most thoroughly and recovered least, and the places that survived best. The more peripheral, the more self-sufficient, the less dependent on the palace redistribution system and the long-distance trade networks, tended to show more continuity, more resilience, more of whatever thread of civilization carried forward into the dark centuries that followed: the bread in the oven at Ugarit, the emergency bronze requisitions at Pylos, the storage jars sunk into the floors at Troy, the abandoned archives of Hattusa carried out by people who knew they were leaving forever. These are not symbols. They are physical facts dug out of the earth by archaeologists who were not looking for drama, but found it anyway, baked into the clay and preserved in the ash of the world's first recorded civilizational collapse. Every detail is a message from the end of something, not just a city, not just an empire, but an entire way of organizing human life that had taken centuries to build and that, once gone, took centuries more to reconstruct in even partial form. The fire went out across the eastern Mediterranean around 1180 BC, and for 400 years after that, in most of the affected regions, there was very little light. Every generation of scholarship has its paradigm-shifting books, the works that do not merely add to existing knowledge but reorganize it entirely, making everything that came before look like pieces of a puzzle that no one had seen the box for. In 2014, the archaeologist and historian Eric Klein, professor at George Washington University and one of the world's leading experts on the Bronze Age, published a book with a deceptively simple title, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. The date in the title refers to the approximate year of the battle. Ramesses III fought against the Sea Peoples at the Nile Delta, the moment most easily pinpointed as the symbolic apex of the crisis. But the book's real argument is not about a single year or a single battle. It is about a concept: systems collapse. And that concept, borrowed from the language of modern complexity theory and network science, transformed the way scholars understand not just the Bronze Age, but the fundamental mechanics of how civilizations die. The core insight of systems collapse theory is both simple and vertiginous once you fully grasp it. Klein's argument, drawing on decades of his own fieldwork and synthesizing the work of climate scientists, seismologists, linguists, and economists, is this: the Bronze Age civilizations did not collapse because any single cause overwhelmed them. They collapsed because they were a system, a tightly integrated, deeply interdependent network of economies, trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and specialized production. And systems have a property that individual components do not. Systems can fail catastrophically and simultaneously when enough of their interconnections are disrupted at once, even if no single disruption would have been fatal in isolation. A chain of dominoes does not fall because any one domino is weak. It falls because they are connected. Sever those connections, or stress them past their breaking point simultaneously from multiple directions, and the collapse is not linear. It is cascading, accelerating, and total. To understand what this means concretely for the Bronze Age, you have to hold in your mind the extraordinary logistical complexity of what Bronze Age civilization actually required to function. Take a single bronze sword. To make it, you need copper and tin in a roughly 9:1 ratio. The main copper sources in the Late Bronze Age were Cyprus and certain Aegean island deposits. The main tin sources were in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and possibly Anatolia and Western Europe. Those two raw materials had to be extracted, processed, loaded onto ships or pack animals, transported across hundreds or thousands of miles, traded through multiple intermediary merchants, assembled at a manufacturing center, worked by skilled craftsmen into ingots, sold again, transported again, and finally worked by a palace metalsmith into a finished weapon. A single sword represented the coordinated labor of dozens of people across several civilizations, operating over months or years, along supply chains that required functioning ports, reliable sea lanes, honest merchants, stable currencies of exchange, diplomatic relationships secure enough to allow foreign traders safe passage, and enough political stability along the entire route to prevent any single node from being raided or blockaded into uselessness. Remove any one of those conditions and the sword does not get made. Remove several of them simultaneously, and the entire metalworking industry of a Bronze Age palace economy begins to seize. This is what makes the systemic nature of the Bronze Age collapse so important to understand, and so difficult to appreciate without the analytical tools of modern complexity theory. Not everything died. That is the first and most important thing to understand about the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is, strangely, a fact that receives far less attention than the destruction itself, perhaps because survival is quieter and less dramatic than ruin, and history tends to remember the fire more than the people who walked away from it. But the pattern of who survived the collapse and how and in what condition is as revealing as the pattern of who did not. Because the survivors did not survive by accident, they survived for reasons, structural, geographic, economic and political reasons that illuminate, by negative example, exactly why the collapsed civilizations fell so completely and so fast. Read the map of survival and collapse carefully enough, and what you find is not chaos but logic, a logic that rewards certain kinds of organization and punishes others, indifferent to sophistication, loyal only to resilience. Egypt is the hardest case to interpret because Egypt survived. And yet Egypt's survival looks, in the centuries following the crisis, less like triumph and more like a long, slow diminishment from which it never fully recovered. The Nile Valley was simply too geographically self-contained, too agriculturally productive, and too physically isolated by desert on three sides and sea on the north to be overwhelmed even by the accumulated pressures of the late 13th and 12th centuries. The Nile flooded. The grain grew. The population endured. The pharaonic state, battered and reduced, persisted in some form. But the Egypt that emerged on the far side of the Bronze Age collapse was a shadow of the empire that Ramesses II had commanded. The foreign territories, Syria, Canaan, Nubia to the south, were gradually lost or abandoned. The treasury that had funded the great building programs of the new kingdom slowly emptied and was never refilled to the same level. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III were, with a few exceptions, weak figures dominated by priests, generals, and foreign mercenary commanders who held the real levers of power. By the end of the 11th century BC, Egypt had effectively split in two, the north ruled by pharaohs in name, and the south by the high priests of Amun in practice. The great civilization survived, the great empire did not. They are not the same thing. The story of Phoenician emergence is among the most instructive in all of ancient history, and one of the great lessons in the relationship between systemic vulnerability and systemic resilience. The Canaanite city-states of the Levantine coast, the predecessors of what we call the Phoenicians, were part of the Bronze Age world. They traded, they corresponded, they sent tribute to Egypt and goods to the Mycenaean Greeks, and they too suffered in the collapse. Ugarit, the greatest of the Canaanite trading cities, was destroyed and never rebuilt. But the cities further south along the coast, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, survived. And every great historical mystery has a shelf life. Most of them eventually yield to new excavations, better analytical tools, a change in scholarly perspective that suddenly makes the evidence readable in ways it was not before. But a few mysteries are different. A few mysteries grow more complex with every answer, opening new questions faster than they close old ones, resisting resolution not because the evidence is scarce, but because the event itself was genuinely, structurally too complicated to reduce to a single cause and a clean narrative. The Bronze Age collapse is one of those mysteries. After more than a century of serious scholarship, after the application of paleoclimatology and dendrochronology and isotope geochemistry and network theory and systems analysis, after thousands of excavated sites and tens of thousands of translated tablets, we still cannot answer the most fundamental question with the precision that history usually demands: what exactly caused it? And some of the most serious scholars working in the field today believe that the honest answer is that we may never fully know. The climate theory is the most scientifically robust explanation on the table. The pollen data, the tree rings, the isotope records all converge on a severe, multi-decade drought beginning around 1200 BC. The evidence is real, independent, and corroborated across multiple methodologies, and yet the climate theory runs immediately into a problem that its proponents cannot dismiss: earlier droughts. The Eastern Mediterranean had experienced severe droughts before 1200 BC. The region is climatically volatile. Prolonged dry periods are not unusual across its geological history. There were likely significant droughts in the early Bronze Age, around 2200 BC, and those droughts do coincide with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. But the civilizations of the Late Bronze Age had weathered prior climate stress within their own histories and survived it. Egypt managed the Nile's variability for millennia. The Hittites held Anatolia through periods of documented hardship. The question is not whether the drought around 1200 BC was severe. The question is, what was different this time? What made this drought fatal when earlier ones were merely damaging? The climate theory answers what happened. It struggles to fully explain why this specific moment, and not the ones before, proved irreversible. The Sea Peoples theory faces an equally pointed objection from the opposite direction. If the Sea Peoples were the primary cause of the Bronze Age collapse, the invading force that swept away the palace civilizations, then where did they go afterward? A people powerful and numerous enough to simultaneously overwhelm the combined military forces of every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean should leave a clear, dominant archaeological footprint in the post-collapse landscape. What we actually find is something far more ambiguous. Some Sea Peoples groups, most likely the ancestors of the biblical Philistines, settled in southern Canaan and established an identifiable material culture there. Others are attested in Cyprus and along the Levantine coast. But there is no post-collapse empire of the Sea Peoples. There is no dominant Sea Peoples civilization that replaced what it destroyed. They dispersed, settled, assimilated, and disappeared into the post-collapse landscape with a speed and completeness that is very difficult to reconcile with the theory that they were a single, organized, purposeful destructive force. The archaeology suggests instead what earlier chapters argued. The Sea Peoples were multiple groups, probably set in motion by the same forces destroying the civilizations they appear to have attacked, and their dispersal reflects the condition of refugees finding places to settle rather than conquerors consolidating a victory. The systems collapse theory is perhaps the most intellectually satisfying framework available, because it is the only one that can accommodate all the other causes simultaneously without requiring any of them to be solely responsible. But it too has a problem at its center. If the Bronze Age world collapsed because of cascading systemic failures in a tightly interdependent network, then what triggered the cascade? A chain of dominoes requires a first push. The system's collapse theory explains the mechanics of how the collapse spread and accelerated with devastating clarity. It is less precise about the origin point, the specific combination of stresses in the specific sequence that moved the system from stressed but stable across the tipping point beyond which recovery became impossible. Was it the drought that came first? The Sea Peoples' migrations? The Hittite political fractures that disrupted the overland tin routes? Different scholars weight these differently, and the honest answer is that the data resolution available to us does not allow a definitive sequencing. And then there is the tablet, not the desperate final letter of the Ugarit king that opened this series, which was at least complete, a finished plea that simply went unanswered. There is another tablet from Ugarit, less famous but in some ways more haunting, that was found mid-composition in the ruins. A piece of administrative correspondence that ends not with a signature or seal or conventional closing formula, but simply stops. Mid-sentence, the final signs trail off in a way that suggests the stylus was set down or dropped and never picked up again. The tablet was not fired deliberately. It was hardened by the fire that destroyed the city around it, the heat of catastrophe doing accidentally what the kiln was supposed to do intentionally. The scribe who was writing it simply ceased. We do not know if they fled or were killed or were overwhelmed by events so immediate that completing a bureaucratic record became instantaneously irrelevant. We know only that they stopped mid-sentence at the end of a world and that the sentence has remained unfinished for 3,000 years. It is not evidence, exactly, but it is the most precise image available of what historical mystery actually feels like at its source. An action interrupted, a thought incomplete, a human being in the middle of an ordinary moment when the world stopped being ordinary forever. History is not a story about the past. History is a story about us, told through the past. Every civilization that has ever collapsed, every empire that has ever fallen, every city that has ever been abandoned mid-sentence while the bread was still in the oven, was composed of people who were not planning to collapse. They were planning tomorrow. They were managing today. They were building, trading, governing, loving, arguing, writing letters, firing clay tablets, provisioning armies, and living lives as dense and ordinary and full of small concerns as any life being lived right now by anyone reading these words. They did not know they were at the edge. They did not feel the ground cracking beneath the weight of everything they had built. They felt, in most cases, exactly what we feel: the normal friction of a complicated world, the manageable stress of a system under pressure, the reasonable confidence of people who have navigated difficulty before and expect, because they always have before, to navigate it again. The Bronze Age collapse ended in roughly 1150 BC, when the last palace fires had gone out and the last scribes had set down their pens. The world that followed was quieter, smaller, less connected, less literate, less ambitious, less capable in almost every material sense than the world that preceded it. It was also, eventually, the world from which everything we consider the foundation of Western civilization emerged: Greek philosophy, monotheistic religion, alphabetic literacy, democratic political thought, the Homeric epics that encode the memory of the age just before the collapse in the only form that survived the darkness. The survivors, and the children of the survivors, and the generations after them built something new from the wreckage of what had been. They always do. Humanity is extraordinarily resilient at the species level, even when it is catastrophically fragile at the civilizational level. The Bronze Age did not end humanity, it ended a way of organizing humanity, and what replaced it, though it took centuries to emerge, was in many ways more durable, more distributed, more philosophically rich than what the collapse destroyed. But that is cold comfort, and it's important to hold it at the correct temperature. The people of Ugarit did not survive to see the Phoenician trading empire that rose from the ashes of their world. The scribes of Mycenae did not live to read Homer. The administrators of Hattusa did not witness the Iron Age civilizations that eventually rose on the ruins of the Hittite plateau. The historians of the future, whenever they write about the 21st century, may note that whatever came after our civilization was interesting and resilient, and eventually productive. Hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and drop your theory in the comments below. What do you think was the real cause? We read every single one, and as always, the past is never really past.